that my Wi-Fi will dip out, so I'll just come back on. I just got to restart it. It takes 2 seconds, but just as a heads up.
That's fine. Okay. So I'm going to start letting people in.
I'm using my old school Power Broker copy for my computer stand.
Love it.
That's very like New York politics.
Great. I use a copy of Jansen's art history text as my computer stand.
I have How to Kill a City, which is by a Hampshire grad, actually.
Oh, great.
I feel like I need one more.
That's like a nice collection in itself. Like what are various, I don't know, the unused books, but new use, repurposed books.
Books collecting cost.
Yeah.
Yeah, I shamelessly for the indivisible debate for the New York 12 race, I like went out to the living room where none of our books are, but I like my wife and I moved stuff so it looked like my bookshelf was behind there. It was like shameless political theater, which I guess I'm not above, but.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Great. Well, I think it's like 5 minutes in almost. I just wanted to sort of say hello to everyone coming in the room. Thank you for joining us. Maybe while we're waiting for more people to come in, I'm just gonna go over little housekeeping things. If you have questions, here we go. Great. Okay. So if you have questions, just type them into the chat box. You can unmute yourself if you want, but it's sort of better, just easier, you know, sort of less chaotic to just put in the chat box. And if there's anything that comes up that you want clarification on, or, you know, something you want defined, or something you'd want to know a little bit more of like history of, say like a particular policy issue, that's a great thing to ask a question about. Or, you know, if there's something that sounds particularly exciting, great. Okay. We just got a question. All right. Do you guys want to start? And I'll introduce you. So we have some people now.
Sure.
Okay, great. So we are here speaking with Patrick Bobilin, who's as you know, candidate for New York State Assembly, and very exciting about that. He's a former teacher, an activist, and organizer, actually previously ran for city council, and started the nightly vigils up at Carl Schurz Park, which I think is a really wonderful thing. You know, obviously so much more than that, but we'll get there. And also with Peter Harrison, who's a former candidate for New York's 12th congressional district, which I'm very sad that you are not our rep now, but in the future, a CUNY union delegate and a housing activist. So we're just thrilled to have you here to speak about, you know, housing reform, healthcare, and you know, all these connected issues that are important to all of us, and all of the wonderful proposals within Patrick's campaign. And I would just say, for the people who are joining us, we have two serious experts here on all of these kind of policy issues and the histories of them and the future of them. So this is just a really great opportunity to ask questions, and really take it as a learning opportunity. Great. So, I mean, maybe we can just sort of get started talking about some of the issues that have been really hovering over us as of late. Patrick, when we were getting ready for this conversation, the topic of rent cancellation came up, and the fact that it is just something that's staying an ongoing conversation and not really being addressed at all. And I guess I'm wondering maybe if we could start hearing your reflections on some recent conversations, say that you've had with other people in city politics, and then maybe use that as a springboard to speak about some of your platform proposals and related issues regarding housing and rent reform.
Yeah, great. Thanks for the introduction, Lauren. And yeah, there have been a lot of conversations about the idea of canceling rent in the last few months. I mean, really, since there was a looming worry that we might have to shut things down, that people would lose their jobs. I mean, a lot of people were ready to say, we have to seriously consider canceling rent. Even our city council speaker, Corey Johnson, was blasting hashtag cancel rent, cancel rent, cancel rent for the first few weeks of that. And then there's actually like funny story. So he's going to be running for mayor in 2021. So watch out for Corey Johnson. He's currently the speaker of the city council, and he has like a monthly spot on Brian Lara's show, the 10 to 12 slot on WNYC. And I'm a frequent call-in guest known as Patrick from Yorkville. And so Patrick from Yorkville called, and he asked Corey Johnson, what's the deal with canceling rent? When are we going to get serious about this? Because this was about mid-May, 2 months into the shutdown. And to my surprise, and I think a lot of people's surprise, he was backpedaling, and he was saying, oh, well, we have to worry about, the real estate tax base. It provides so much of our tax base. And it was a serious backpedal, so serious that honestly, it turned into a Politico article. You can, dig for if you're really into that. Politico was like, wow, Corey Johnson, backpedals on, his calls for canceling rent. And, for me, that, my next question, if I had a follow-up, would have been like, well, how did we get here? How did we set ourselves up where, our biggest issue, our biggest resource in this city is our real estate, is our land. And how did we end up in such a place where we are afraid to seize rent, to seize properties? We are afraid to cancel rent when it means deep levels of bankruptcy and debt for our citizens and the survival of our city. How did we get here, and how could we better structure our tax base where we're not beholden to landlords and major real estate corporations? So the state of canceling rent right now, there have been a lot of means tested concepts that are in the state, in the state assembly and the state senate. I happen to be running for the state assembly. And some of the means tested legislation has gotten some traction, but the real meat and potatoes, cancel rent for commercial and residential renters, is not getting as much traction. And unfortunately, I think we can all admit, and we can all see that we're living in, neighborhoods where we're watching our favorite neighborhood institutions leave potentially, and businesses dying everywhere. And when you have a business that's, people travel the world to come see, like the Stonewall Inn, that needs to raise, have a fundraiser, then we're doing something wrong. If we don't have a system in place to protect, beloved, storied, historical institutions. Like, imagine if, we were worried about, the Met closing down because they couldn't make rent or something like that. Like, at what level, are we going to allow, real estate developers and landlords to dictate what the history and future of this city is? So, Yulin Miao, who is an assemblywoman from Lower Manhattan, she's got a bill in place right now. And Mike Chinaris, who's a state senator in Queens, they're working on sort of twin legislation in the Senate and House, the Assembly and the Senate, state Senate, respectively. And they're struggling to get, people to organize around this, but it's something that, is very important to me, and something that, I really want to get behind and really start organizing around this state, like getting into, lower income towns and cities, neighborhoods in Buffalo, Rochester, Albany, Amsterdam, New York, like to say, like, look, like, we need to cancel rent around this state, like not even just New York City. Yeah, so that's a major issue around my platform, my history as an organizer, and how, I hope to be able to use that sort of organizing prowess that's, created the nightly vigils that Carl Schurz, for example, into organizing for issues that can really, protect people and protect the future of the state and the city.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and among those ideas, what I just think, like, why don't we have this already? Like universal rent control, but then also commercial rent control. And so maybe that just leads me to the question of, like, why is it that we don't have these things kind of already baked into our system, which feel so basic, actually? Yeah.
Pete, do you want to take this? Or do you want me to take it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can jump in a little bit. Patrick mentioned this in his response. First, that we have a tax base that is almost exclusively based on property values. And that wasn't always the case. We used to have a much more diverse tax base, light industrial, heavy industrial, you name it. That basically ended by the 70s. So, this sort of idea of like the real estate state emerging from that period, Sam Stein talks about that in his book, which I definitely recommend. It changed so much that basically the incentive of the state and the city governments were, how do you raise property values? And there's a logic there that you can sort of squint at and say, okay, I guess that makes sense. That's where gentrification, over policing, all of these things come into play at that point. But what's really sort of hypocritical about that is, on the one hand, you have a tax base that's almost exclusively based on property value. And yet, because real estate is so powerful, it's almost a monopoly in a political sense, that they get all these freebies from state, from city agencies. So on the one hand, we are putting everything into raising property values and over policing, gentrifying, displacing communities of color. But then we're actually turning that around and actually just giving away an immense amount of public wealth to these developers. So we're, on the one hand, completely limited ourselves to what our city can produce. And then that one thing that actually produces income, we're still actually giving it away. And, you mentioned commercial rent control. This is the same thing for residential. It's slightly different. I think I see Billy on the call here. City council can talk a little bit more about commercial rent control, but the state is really where everything in terms of residential housing comes down to. And obviously we have some rent stabilization laws in place on the residential side, and plenty of problems with that. That's part of why the universal rent control victories in 2019 are so important. That's why there's so much that has to happen with getting Patrick in there. But there's nothing there for commercial. And the really perverse thing about that is that you see so many places, it's true in Yorkville, it's true down where I live in the East Village, that there's so many commercial properties that are already empty, that were empty before COVID, in some cases for years. And that gets down to the perverse incentives of property tax law, where a landlord that has commercial property has every incentive to keep that empty because they can write that off on their property tax bill. So if they don't get a CVS, a Citibank, a Starbucks in to pay that exorbitant rent, then they can basically sit on it and wait for that bank to come in. So, there's some interesting ideas at both the state and the city level to deal with those problems. But, here we are, boom, COVID happens. And that to some degree has changed some of the conversations and some of the politics on the ground, but in many ways it hasn't. So, the idea of where do we get the protections for small businesses, where do we get the protections for renters that now don't have income coming in? You're right, we don't have that infrastructure put in place. And the sort of thing that Corey Johnson won't necessarily admit, or some of the folks even up in Albany won't admit, is that rent is never getting paid, right? The residential rent for us that we haven't been working, the commercial rent for your favorite sushi place that hasn't been open for 4 months, like that's never coming back. And the fact that our political system really at every level, city, state, and federal, can't talk about that honestly is a major problem, because we all look at it as the obvious solution is you can't pay that back. Like the renter can't pay the landlord, that rare mom and pop landlord that kind of exists but doesn't really exist, can't pay their lender. Like that's a chain of events that the cancel rent campaign really kind of gets to the core of. It's not just canceling rent for tenants, as you know, as Patrick was saying. It is about protecting commercial properties. It's even about protecting small homeowners and working class homeowners, because like the money's not there. It's never coming back. So that has to happen at the state level. That has to happen at the federal level. But you just got to have people in office that can sort of be honest and just say what's obvious. I mean, the fact that it takes some political courage for Patrick from Yorkville to like point out the obvious here, and then a Corey Johnson sort of backtracks from it, is a really big problem at, again, every level of our politics.
Mm-hmm. And that it's statewide too. I mean, I'm just thinking that, you know, so my university is up in Ithaca, New York. I mean, I live in Brooklyn, but, you know, I know both areas fairly well now. But even before COVID, you know, we get into this situation where like commercial rents are able to just go up so high, so fast, and landlords benefit from having empty spaces that that empty commercial storefronts just end up sitting there for years on end, you know, and who does that serve? Nobody. So, you know, which is just to say that this is absolutely not a city issue. It is a state issue, and that there's so many kind of incentives in place that feel like completely backwards or completely like antithetical to actually helping like local businesses thrive and communities thrive. We have one question, which maybe would be, if one of you are interested in taking on, would moving from a property tax system to a land value tax system have any meaningful impact on the issues we are discussing?
Short answer, yes. And just for folks watching, and I think Patrick and I had beers about this at some point, but
what I think of beers about.
Yeah, back with the before times when we could talk about nerdy stuff in person. But yeah, the idea, just of a quick review, the land value tax is an idea going back to the Gilded Age. And the basic sense is, of course, property taxes in America right now gauge a certain percentage of a subjective value, what the land is, and you kind of base a tax bracket kind of sort of from there. And that kind of does create these perverse incentives where you're kind of taxing the speculative value of the land, which can be manipulated in so many different ways and so many different reasons. But a land value tax is at its base a really pretty pure, debatably socialist idea of, if a land is basically taxed on a sense of productivity, like what can you produce from the land? Obviously, in the Gilded Age, you had some industrial like farming and whatever, but in Manhattan, it's, you know, you've got to build taller buildings and have more productive use from that. And a land value tax kind of takes away that perverse incentive we were talking about earlier, where a landlord can kind of sit on an empty storefront, can kind of like slowly kick out rent stabilized landlords and try to sort of flip a property. A land value tax really makes it very clear, if you're not producing value, new value for that land, you're going to be taxed on it anyway. So it exists in certain places. It's never been particularly popular as an idea in America. And there's so many fascinating like racial land use issues behind why that's the case, racial exclusionary policies. But as a core idea, I mean, it's starting to become more popular. We worked on this with Data for Progress, and I was the housing coordinator there. We got into Bernie Sanders' housing plan. So it's an idea that does kind of take away both, you know, in City Hall and in Albany, these kind of shitty incentives where landlords can kind of sit and speculate. But if you're sitting on a property that's not being productive, you're still getting taxed for it. So even if your storefront's empty, sorry, Mr. Landlord, like that's land that we've evaluated a certain productivity, you're not using it, so you're gonna have to get taxed for it anyway. That kind of does create the incentives to be more productive with it. So I hope that's in Patrick's platform. That's pretty like, you know, in the weeds type stuff, but I know Patrick supports it.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about productivity, we should talk about labor, and we should talk about labor issues. And I actually, not to deflect from speaking more, but I do want to hear sort of what's been going on with CUNY in the last like couple of months post-COVID. I know that there was about less than a year ago, there was the 7K or strike movement to get three credit courses paid at least 7,000, which is still ridiculously low. Right now there are, in the last couple of months, there were the announcements of layoffs and people getting kicked off of their health insurance, faculty being kicked off their health insurance even though they were eligible. What's the current state of affairs there?
Yeah, I mean, just like housing, COVID didn't sort of create any problems in CUNY. It just sort of expedited a lot of them. And I'm sure this is true across the board for even private education, Lauren. But yeah, last year was the contract with CUNY and the union had expired in 2017, and it sort of defaulted to the payment schedule in 2017. It had been an ongoing negotiation that kind of came to a head in 2019. And there was a group of adjuncts I was a part of that was really trying to be really skeptical both of the contract and of union membership leadership signing off for that. And 7K or strike was successful of kind of at least finding other radical or more militant labor organizers within some of the CUNY campuses. But the contract we really were against. We were trying to get more folks to go against it because it didn't go far enough. It didn't get to the 7K. It didn't change some of the basic structural problems of CUNY, the adjunct and tenure track professors. But we couldn't get anywhere. We just couldn't create more militancy in the faculty, in the union. So that contract got passed. Then, of course, literally the ink was dry on this contract, and all of a sudden the $6 billion budget deficit before COVID comes out, and Cuomo's saying, "Oh shucks, we got to cut more." Then CUNY saying, "Oh shucks, we got to cut more," and then the union leadership's sort of waffling on what that really means for members, and that was the sort of lead up into COVID. And obviously everywhere in public sector land, from the MTA to the K through 12 to CUNY, it's a disaster. And that budget deficit, I think, is at $13 billion now. So even before COVID, wow, it was still a struggle. It was a struggle internally with the union to really kind of militant organize more resistance. But COVID has created some opportunities with the sort of more moderate folks within CUNY to say, hey, wait a minute, like, we're getting screwed here, and why don't we figure out ways to generate more revenue rather than cut everything deeply? The CARES Act, the first federal stimulus emergency bill, did provide some funding for both like students who were qualified for low income, which is 70% of CUNY students, which was great. That got distributed. And then there was a pretty big lawsuit actually about that other chunk of CARES Act money that should have gone to protecting faculty. And instead of that happening, 2,800 adjuncts were just fired at the end of the spring semester, or more appropriately, not reappointed is the sort of like Kafkaesque term to say that you're not fired, but you're just not rehired. That kicked people off healthcare, that obviously denigrated an immense amount of teachers. My class for the fall at Baruch College, because of that, I'm lucky that I got reappointed, but my cap has gone up. I've got 65 students now. So, I mean, it's a bad state of affairs, and CUNY's leader, the CUNY PCCS union leadership has finally kind of gotten more militant. As we're speaking tonight, there's a 24-hour online action happening with the union to sort of generate more militancy on the first day of the semester. Of course, the 7K or strike folks, we evolved into rank and file action. I can send the link to follow us on Twitter. I think we've got some like 3 o'clock in the morning, like public access TV slot for like our organizing efforts. So it's a slog, but I mean, this is true of everywhere, Patrick, of labor, right? It's like, there's no more urgent time for labor organizing right now in this country. And it's not, the infrastructure is just not there. It's so atrophied in these big unions. And it's starting to wake up. I'm like vaguely optimistic that some of these things are happening, but it's you got to have good people in office in Albany, and we have some allies up there. We'll hopefully have some more, but it does take the faculty, the students, the existing organizing structure there. That's pretty militant and pretty exciting. I mean, this really is CUNY students leading a lot of this stuff, which is really exciting. But it takes getting more of those folks in for a general strike, and we'll see if that happens. It's if you can't organize during a pandemic where people are dying and people are being put to risk just on an everyday job, then it'll never happen. So the fact that it's starting to happen is encouraging.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and one of the things you've just highlighted is, I mean, my gosh, just like the massive levels of support that are needed for people who are students in the CUNY system, who people are faculty and students in the CUNY system, but especially students who, as you said, 70% fall under the low income bracket, if I'm right. Which I think is maybe a nice pivot to some of Patrick's plans for how to help CUNY and SUNY students with these sort of basic daily life resources that they might need, like housing and healthcare.
Yeah.
Or childcare.
Well, yeah, part of my platform includes, housing and childcare vouchers for all CUNY and SUNY students. Because when Cuomo announced the Excelsior Scholarship, my criticism of, giving, free tuition to low-income people was that, tuition was, as a low-income person myself, tuition was never really the issue. And for better or worse, you could bury yourself in loans for that. The real issue was, how do you pay for your day-to-day needs? And, I happen to also, be the parent of a 19-year-old mom who didn't go to college until I was out of the house, because she didn't have those opportunities to, she didn't have childcare. She didn't have, housing taken care of. And so if we really want to touch the people who are most impacted by inequalities in, academics, it's going to be people who have to take care of their families, or who need help with covering their housing. But there's a couple of things I want to actually respond to. I think it's important to keep things in perspective. When Peter's talking about CUNY being $6 billion in the hole, and them not paying, them losing track of 130 million that they were given by the federal government, right, for the CARES Act. This was to keep people employed. It was to help their faculty and staff. That 132 million is also 2% of that $6 billion hole. So if they're looking for where the holes are, it's not going to be in the faculty and staff. And they, there's so often like the scapegoating of workers and, labor costs in moments like this, where, they claim that labor cost is their biggest issue, but why is it so low compared to the $6 billion that they owe, or they're in the hole for? So that kind of stuck out at me, but
yeah, I mean, it's the same thing, Patrick, with the MTA, right? I mean, they've stopped doing the free local buses because the MTA accountant saying we need every dollar. It's like, you're billions of dollars in the hole. A couple $1,000,000 per month is not a lot, but it's a ton for those low income workers that are essential workers. And yeah, it's those people that get beat up on this stuff.
There's a funny slippage of language. I mean, not to get too lost in anything, but like a funny slippage of language when people start talking about millions and billions, and people really lose perspective, forgetting that, there's $1 and there's $1,000, there's, we're 1 million in the hole. We did that 1,000 times. We are now 1 billion in the hole. So yeah, you can't patch up holes with a few $1 million from fares. Absolutely. I talked with someone today from the Riders Alliance who was telling me that, for the first time in a long time, they're not on bad terms with the state. The state's doing the most that they can. They're now worried about now it's up to the federal government to sort of fund. And that in and of itself is like a scary prospect, that not only did this, for decades we've fought in the city to control the MTA in the city with the state, who there was a deal brokered, I think, in the 70s where we gave control of the MTA up to the state. We're no longer even fighting the state in Albany. We're fighting DC, which is like just a whole other bag. But to pivot over to the platform, there's the childcare and housing vouchers. There's also the Green New Deal. Believe it or not, Cuomo signed on to a vague set of platitudes of a Green New Deal at the state level, but we don't have any legislation for it yet. But to me, that's like an unclaimed opportunity. And it's also an unclaimed opportunity for us to start getting our tax base, diversifying our tax base away from just real estate and property. Because if we're producing or, creating energy, or we're, whatever, building solenoids upstate somewhere, we could be sort of at the vanguard of these things. And I was talking to Lauren in a conversation the other day, and I'm like, I'm not too sure, where the sort of labor needs of the Green New Deal are. I mean, there's converting buildings and a lot of construction, but there's also a lot of adaptation and creation of new systems. And it could be anything from a whole load of graphic designers who need to be employed to create interfaces for working new systems. Like it's sort of a blank canvas, what we need and what we could get from a Green New Deal in a way. If we have to radically convert our entire infrastructure in this way, it opens up so many possibilities. And it also, like, at a time when unemployment is through the roof, yet somehow the stock market's up, we could be like creating, but we could be creating like quality, good paying jobs, right now. And I hate to be like, John Kasich or like an 80s politician or something and saying we need jobs, but we do need jobs right now. And we have a great opportunity with, a twofold opportunity to save the earth and save the state and also, create new jobs with the Green New Deal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, Patrick, with, Cuomo has sort of always towed that line of sort of being pro Green New Deal-ish, but not kind of. And some of the stuff that's been passed in Albany have some pretty good goals, but there isn't a lot of follow-up of like how to get there. And even to your point, like there's an immense amount of economic opportunity for diversifying the economy based on this stuff. And even just, this is outside of your district, but the East River Resiliency Project down by us, this has been kicking around since Sandy. And it basically is going to create a seawall around Wall Street up to sort of 26th Street. And I guess, some geography by your district, but Roosevelt Island's not that much higher off the water. So the idea of like putting millions of dollars with some federal money, state money, city money into this plan that doesn't even protect against basic sea rising levels. It would probably like stop a Superstorm Sandy surge, which is good, but obviously it doesn't solve the longer term problems. Mm-hmm. And that just shows you like how asinine the planning of these things are, where even if Cuomo kind of takes it seriously, and at least at some point the federal government sort of took it seriously, the solution to this was this completely half-assed partial plan to protect, my internet might be going out.
Oh.
If you can hear me.
Yeah, we got you. You're good. Yeah.
But yeah, you've got this like completely half-assed solution of, well, we got the money together for this little chunk of lower Manhattan, not even like the entire East River Basin, or not even thinking about it as like, well, the sea's going to rise anyway. So what happens to the Rockaways? What happens to other parts of it? It's just such a missed opportunity to say, let's sit back here for a second and think about this statewide. Let's think about what we need goal-wise, because it has to be through the states. Like the funding, the money has to come from the federal government, but it has to come from the state to say, here's a plan to protect certain parts of the coastlines and figure out where we can get energy elsewhere from the state and from our own sources, and that just isn't happening. So like nobody's taking this seriously. So it's not just an economic question. It really is a basic quality of life. I mean, it's at some point we can't stay here if that these kinds of things aren't being done.
Yeah,
True.
especially with Superfund sites lagging on the water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we have two questions in the chat box, which, Patrick, maybe I'll let you take in either order. One is speaking about your reasons for running against Rebecca Seawright in the campaign, and maybe if you want to say a little bit about the oddities leading up to your run. But then also, what city level actions do you need the city council and mayor to champion?
Okay. Yeah. I can talk about the first one. What are my reasons for running? So it's a kind of complicated election in my district. There is, as of today, only a Republican on the ballot because our local Democrat failed to get on the ballot as a Democrat or a working families candidate. And I've been involved in politics in this neighborhood, these districts for a while, and that's how I got to know Peter. But I was finding that there were a large number of like local Democratic organizers, activists who were telling me, oh, so what if we have a Republican for a couple of years? Who cares? To me, that was a very unsettling proposition because, especially in this neighborhood, and it's not something that unfortunately has gotten a lot of press, but there's the Metropolitan GOP Club, and they're a Republican club that finds candidates, helps them get on the ballot, and when you're endorsed by a Democratic or a Republican club, they're that's like the hand of God reaching out of the sky and plucking you and putting you on the ballot. But they're responsible for Giuliani. They're responsible for Mayor Bloomberg. And so about a year ago, they had an election for a new president of their club. And the president of one of these clubs sets the direction and the priorities. Well, their new president of their club was a consultant for the Alternative for Deutschland, which is the neo-Nazi right-wing party that for a couple of years, actually in recent history, had seats in the German parliament. And so the guy who organizes there decided to bring his talents to the Upper East Side's Metropolitan GOP Club. And they hosted people like Gavin McInnes and the Proud Boys and had all these like violent riots outside against people who were protesting them. And so I actually had a protest with some local Democratic organizers about the election of this guy. And now this guy, I mean, it's kind of inside baseball, but it's also not. Like this guy was being promoted by Milo Yiannopoulos online. It was a whole campaign to make sure that this guy gets voted in. And, they have a setup of proxy voting that most clubs have gotten rid of. But it means that like 17,000 people could sign up online and become members of this club. And they could say, hey, Lauren, when you go today, will you bring all 17,000 of our votes for this, piece of garbage? And they did. They ended up voting this guy in. And so why is this history important? Well, the Manhattan GOP has plucked another guy, a guy I've met before. He's a friendly guy, but he's a local doorman, and he ran against Rebecca Seawright a couple of years ago on like a third party and got like 500, protest votes. Well, this guy has been plucked as the Republican candidate, and now like statewide, citywide, old school 70s and 80s Republicans who used to be in power are trying to get their first Manhattan assembly district in over 30 years, and they're putting all their chips onto this guy. And so I woke up one day knowing we only had a Republican on the ballot. And I looked up, in the middle of this crisis, they kind of, Peter knows this because he was working to get on the ballot when the crisis hit, and they had to truncate the petitioning period to get on the ballot, where you go out and collect signatures from people. They moved the petitioning period for months in advance for independent petitioning. And so I decided I would try to get on as an independent. And I announced my campaign the day that the signature collection started. In 3 weeks, we got 50 volunteers, 3,000 or 4,000 signatures to get on the ballot. And it was, we're off to the races now. It turns out that Rebecca Seawright, who is the sitting assemblywoman who failed to get on the ballot 2 times before and was kicked off the ballot, is now also running as an independent. You know, that's fine, but you know, I've been organizing in the neighborhood, I've been working in the neighborhood, I've been on the ground. So, you know, I feel like we have a lot of different values also, and now she's trying to kick me off the ballot after complaining for months about herself getting kicked off the ballot over a technicality. She's now trying to disprove my eligibility to be on the ballot. So it's a whole mess inside politics, but it's also something that you'll see, you know, these old school traditional politicians do. It's the way that they build and maintain power. They actually tried this same, they used the same lawyer and they used the same statewide PAC funds to try to get rid of Zohran Mamdani, Farah Soufran, is that how you say her name? Marcella Mateanis, and who is the fourth one? Emily Gallagher from, I think, from Greenpoint. They tried to do that to all 4 of them and they failed. So they're trying to do the same thing to me. I guess that's what happens when, you know, you challenge a Democrat from the left. They fight you harder than they fight Republicans, but c'est la vie.
Yeah. Well, and Emily Gallagher won our district of, you know, taking the seat of a 50-year incumbent. So
yeah,
so
they're not on a
that was
good
an
streak
exciting
right
one.
now.
Yeah. Well, we have a quick follow-up, which I think makes sense given the context. How would you distinguish yourself from Seawright?
So as far as my ethics and politics go, I am out here to, you know, open and cancel rent. I'm out here looking to organize for the New York Health Act rather than sort of passively vote for it. And I have been a Black Lives Matter organizer for years, and am now, you know, organizing my neighbors and, you know, sort of offering them of the value of civic life during a pretty unlikely time in the middle of COVID. And, you know, we have 100, 200, 300, 400 people coming out every night of the week to ask for a complete revision of a reimagining of our criminal justice system. And I don't see her doing that. In fact, she's on a committee that needed to pass the repeal of 50A, and she missed out on that vote for the repeal of 50A. Thankfully, it still passed both her committee and the floor, but it doesn't get to the floor of the assembly if it doesn't pass your committee first. And to be missing on the day of such an important vote is, you know, really troubling to me. So, you know, there are issues like that. There are issues like public schools versus charter schools. A lot of, you know, my opponent's work has been, you know, to help out charter schools. And I, you know, I'm a product of the New York State public schools, which were already deprived when I was a kid, and have only gotten worse since in a lot of ways. And we have the most segregated school system in the country here. And it's not because all of the new people moving to Brooklyn and Queens are racist and they don't want their kids, you know, in, you know, mixed race classrooms. It's because if you're a parent and you have 2 options, send your kid to a school with an arts program, send your kid to a school without one, you're going to pick the one with the arts program. Well, unfortunately, it's only charter schools, which have, you know, sort of been, you know, eating at the edges of public school funding for years through co-learning spaces, you know, and shared facilities. They're taking a lot of resources away from what we should be giving to our public schools. And to me, that's sort of, you know, an essential thing right now, especially, you know, in the middle of this pandemic, in the middle of this crisis. You know, we have to make sure that we're overfunding our schools, if nothing else. We have teachers who are already paying for school supplies. Don't tell me they're not also pocketing the money for, you know, or they're not having to come out of their pocket for PPE.
No, I mean, it's still, actually, there's somebody on here who I know, their partner is a high school teacher, and, you know, forgive me to use the anecdote, but, you know, we were speaking the other night, and she said that he still doesn't know what the plan is for reopening. And high schools are supposed to reopen in what, like 2 weeks? I mean, this is a scary situation here. But you brought up the New York Health Act, which I wanted to really talk about, because I think surprisingly, it's something that just in conversations that I've had with people, a lot of people don't really know about. And don't really know that it's something that's been kicking around in the state assembly and state senate actually for quite some time. But for whatever reasons, there just hasn't been the political will in place to really move it forward. But I think it's such an important issue. And so I do want to spend a little bit of time just, I think, for everyone sort of hearing a little bit more about it, and then hearing what its hopeful future is.
The New York Health Act, and feel free to jump in at any time, Peter, if you have something to add, because I know a bit about it. But so it's a comprehensive care plan that includes vision, it includes dental, it includes long-term senior care, and of course kids. And it is a plan that's been passing the assembly like clockwork for a couple of sessions now. And the little trick of math here is that at the state senate level, the state senate was controlled until 2019 by Republicans, basically, by a bunch of Democrats who had sort of tacitly agreed to vote with Republicans. So a lot of progressive legislation that was passing the assembly easily, which is sort of the analogy is going to be like the House of Representatives and the US Senate. There's a lot more members in the assembly, and they, have smaller districts, and, they speak more of the voice of the people. And then the state senate, which have larger districts and different interests. So the assembly had been passing progressive legislation like clockwork, and it made all the sort of centrist, moderate assembly members look like they were super progressive. But at the state level, the stuff was getting knocked out of knocked down left and right. Now we've got a concretely Democrat, supposedly progressive state senate, and the New York Health Act can't seem to get out of committee all of a sudden. And part of that, I think, has to do with the fact that, like you said, like it's not something that a lot of people know about. It's not rolling off the tongue the way Medicare for All is, even though it's pretty much a repackaged, version of the same plan. Saves the state $13 billion a year. Like, it makes a lot of sense, but it takes a fair amount of organizing to make these things happen. It took some organizing to make Medicare for All happen. So that's something that, is very comfortable to me. It's something that I look forward to doing, is going into, building coalitions with all of my colleagues in the assembly, making sure that, I get as much support as possible. And if I can't get support, I'm going to go to your neighborhood, I'm going to find your people, and I'm going to get them to know about this, and I'm going to get them to bother you about it. My favorite anecdote about organizing, because I really think that organizing works, and I think, probably everyone on this call would agree, but my favorite anecdote is comes from a little known Burlington mayor named Bernie Sanders, who won his first election by a couple dozen votes, I think. And he was dealing with a Republican city council. And so what is he going to do? The progressive guy, the socialist who wants to pass things that are Republican city council, they're going to knock everything out, that he wanted to pass. Well, he went into every single city council district where there was a Republican. He plucked somebody out. He helped them organize, and he won every one of those districts in the next election 2 years later, because, or he got a Democrat to win in all those elections, because organizing works. I mean, if you go into someone's backyard, they kind of don't expect it. I mean, most of the political establishment, both on the left and the right, don't really do the work of organizing once they're in office. And but you see newer people like Julia Salazar going out on picket lines. She was out with the art workers union, I believe, or the art handlers union, because progressive legislators realize, younger ones especially, like, not to be ageist, but the new generation of people realizes that organizing really does work. And if we bring something as easily likable as the New York Health Act to 20 million people around the state, it's going to be hard for it not to pass. But it's not something that rolls off the tongue, and it's not something that, you know, a lot of people even know about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think this really speaks to the frustration most people have with electoral politics, and a weird thing that most people have no idea who their city council person is, their state assembly, their state senator, maybe their congressional member, maybe the governor, senator, whatever. And you basically only have people paying attention occasionally in presidential years. And again, the machines on both of these parties, obviously there's only one party in Manhattan and most of New York City, but they like that. It's a closed system. You wait your turn, you run when you've done everything right, and you do the right policies, and you take the right money. Like, that's how the system has been for many, many years. And obviously it just did not work from a practical sense, going back to what we were saying earlier, that just politics stopped solving the real problems. And the mistake that, I don't even think it's a mistake, but the reality is that people stopped thinking the government can solve things. And that's been an ideological plan for 40 years by neoliberals in both parties. So it has definitely been this new generation that has grown up without healthcare, without secure housing, without secure prospects, with a planet that might be dying. It's just like a very rational response, I think, for many folks that are a little bit younger, just to say, well, no one's coming to help us, and the private sector is not helping us. In fact, it's exploiting us. So we need the government to work for us. And that does mean at every level. So yeah, I mean, it's the New York Health Act is one of those things where most people don't realize there's a state level Medicare for all that's floating around, and it's a hard thing to organize people through. And I still remember for Cynthia Nixon's campaign against Cuomo in the primary, I was down on Houston Street one day. It was probably a week before the election. This is back in 2018. And it was like it was Nixon and Cuomo. And I realized at the end of that day that it was not zero, the amount of people that thought Richard Nixon was running against Mario Cuomo and the New York governor. And, you know, that's a problem. And I think some of us could look at that and say, oh, people are dumb. Like, that's an organizer knows better. Just people are busy. People are stressed. People are overworked, underpaid. They've got kids. They've got grandparents who are taking care of whatever that is. So, you know, it's not a matter that people don't care about politics. It's that they've never really been able to engage in it. And that's really what, going back to Occupy, that kind of generation of organizers is coming out of, to say it's not going to solve itself. The democratic establishment's not really there for us. They don't even know how to solve these problems. So we've got to get out there and eventually get people in there, because we do need to pass laws, and we've got to get that act out of committees, and you've got to get the right people in, but you've got to get those people to recognize, just like Patrick is, you've got to get out there and keep people organized. It's not about just going out and voting. That's really important, but that's not where the work ends. And in many cases, it's where it starts once you get the person in there. So, you know, I'm always very relieved when somebody like Patrick is running for office, because they get that. And you can see that that's the commitment of just getting out there, knocking on doors. Obviously can't do it right now, but, you know, getting out there, organizing people, that's the relationship we have to have that with government. It's not just you vote once in a while. It's you are a citizen involved in civic organization, and you have a right to say how laws are passed, who are judges, and all of these things. So that's really, you know, where it does matter at all levels to get people like Patrick in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. That's very sweet.
And also,
there's your donate link, Patrick. You got to get it in there.
Oh, yeah.
That's the lesson I learned the hard way. You need money to run for office.
Yes, very
That's
much
true.
so, which is, you know, part of the purpose of this conversation. I'm going to add that link right there. Yeah, well, I guess, I mean, as we're beginning to wrap things up, one, I want to ask if anyone else has another question they'd like to throw out. Please do. And also, I don't know, maybe I'll make like two things. I think it's really important that, well, I don't know, it's like we're all pretty young. I mean, I'm speaking to, you know, Patrick now, because we're about the same age, and Peter, I'm guessing we're relatively the same age. You know, when the recession, the recession hit, it was a nightmare. The 2008 one, I mean, And clearly, you know, wealth inequality has just increased, you know, manifold since then. You know, all of the problems that were in place then just got worse. And so if now the coronavirus recession, as we're calling it now, this can't end up the same way. Like, this cannot be the same missed opportunity, you know, again, because I just can't imagine. I don't want to know what that world looks like. You know, I don't want to live in, I don't want to live here if we don't actually change things.
This planet.
You know, well, I can't really change planets yet, but I don't, yeah. No, but really, you know, I think it's so incumbent on all of us to make sure that this is the place that we want to live, and that we feel actually like cared for by our government, and that we actually have relationships with the people in government. And so maybe on like a personal plug, I feel like I do want to say I've known Patrick for, I was actually like 16 years. I think he just froze, or I just froze. Did I just freeze?
I might have frozen.
I can hear you. Yeah.
You froze. Okay. Anyway, I have to say a personal note. I think we've known each other for like 16 years, which makes me feel really old. But I think I've been sort of endlessly impressed by the many different sort of things you've taken on with so much energy at every turn. And I you know, constantly learn from Patrick, and just the moves that he makes in his life. And, you know, grew up in upstate New York, knows it very, very well, and also knows the city very, very well. And I just think that sort of shared knowledge of how the entire state works, which is such a mixed place, is also like the kind of advocate that we need in state government, because you need to have people there who can speak from the city, you know, the downstate perspective, from the upstate perspective, which are very big, you know, in terms of state politics, a big point of tension that I have learned.
I'm gonna have to rule on or vote on some very arcane agricultural laws and things about domestic, you know, cow rearing and things like that. So
yeah, but that's really important.
I have a little bit of knowledge, for better or worse, about how to shear a sheep. So
yeah, but that's an important thing. I mean, even just to know how to have those conversations, you know, is a really important thing, and that's rare. And I do genuinely think that's what we need. What's your position on domestic cow rearing? We don't have to answer that.
Rear them if you got them.
Yeah. But yeah, so I guess we'll say one more time if anyone has another question.
What is cow rearing? I'm such a city
What is
slicker.
cow rearing?
What that is.
I don't know. I meant rearing, like raising them and
raising them.
breeding.
Yeah.
I guess I meant breeding.
Yeah.
But so actually, you know, one exciting thing, and I think it might surprise a lot of people to sort of bring back, because I feel like a lot of the movement around legalizing marijuana kind of you know, went away in the last couple of years. We kind of see that it's sort of like tacitly legalized, and, you know, we're promised that we're going to create a system that's, you know, equitable, and we, you know, put money towards criminal justice, and, you know, we make sure that anyone who's in jail for possession is immediately released and their records expunged. And those are super important things that, you know, can be done, I think, in an expedited fashion. If we consider the fact that if we push forward this right now with everyone at home, with the amount of sort of free time a lot of people have right now, let's be honest about it. You know, legalization could actually produce a lot of tax revenue right now, and we're seeing right next door, the governor in Pennsylvania is talking about it. So I just want to give everyone this sort of flag to say, like, if you hear anybody talking about this in upcoming months, like, support it, because if we need money, we need to create new revenue, new forms of revenue, new revenue streams. And that's one that's just like waiting for us to cultivate, so to speak. speaking of agriculture.
Yeah. There you go. And fewer upstate prisons, please.
0 actually.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
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 Yeah, I'm an abolitionist.
Yeah. Anyway, that'll take us into another hour, which would be a good one. Well, yeah, I guess I want to throw it back to you, Patrick, then. Are there any more points that you want to bring up?
No, I just, I want everyone to make sure that they become evangelists for a couple of things in the next couple of months. One is to fill out the census. I think your neighborhood, Lauren, and my neighborhood on the Upper East Side, I don't know about yours, Peter, are pretty low compared to previous years. Mine is for a different reason than I think both of your neighborhoods. Mine is because there's a lot of people who are not around or not at home on the Upper East Side, a lot of darkened buildings in the last few months. So become an evangelist for the census. And the other thing is to become an evangelist for, filling out, for requesting your absentee ballot. I think vote.nyc should have everything you need. Because we got to make sure that there's high turnout. Honestly, progressive values win when there's high turnout, and unfortunately we won't get that at the top of the ticket, but I'm willing to bet that most of you have that opportunity lower in the ticket. So yeah, let's make sure we get some numbers on the board for these values that we talk about and we want.
Great. And I want to add to that too, that in addition to fundraising and donating to Patrick's campaign, which is so important, there are also volunteer opportunities. I look forward to phone banking in the future. So I just want to say that these are other options that are going to be coming up too.
Lots of opportunities. Yeah. The campaign's kicking off. Less than 70 days left, so let's get it.
Yeah, great. Well, excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. And vote. Yeah. Pete, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, thank you for having me. I just want to second Patrick, fill out the census. We are at risk of losing trillions of dollars in federal funding. So it's a total moot point, everything we talk about, if we don't get represented at the federal level too. And but yeah, down ballot votes and census, that's really important in the next 70 days.
Great. Yeah, everyone tell your neighbors, make sure they do it. Great. Well, thank you so much. And yeah, please donate to the campaign, volunteer, all of those things that we need to be doing.
Yeah. Stay healthy and safe.
Yeah.
And donate at patrickfornewyork.com.
Yeah. Important. Great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much.